And there's a lot that happens in this chapter. So we're going to only look at the first half. We're going to look at the first 15 verses. Um, and so well, you'll see as we go through. There's quite a bit that takes place in the second half of the chapter. So it was getting too long, so I needed to really cut it down. So 2 Kings chapter 8, like I said, we'll look at the first 15 verses here tonight. But verse 1, it says, Then spake Elisha unto the woman whose son he had restored to life, saying, Arise and go thou to thine household, and sojourn wheresoever thou canst sojourn. For the Lord hath called for a famine, and it shall come upon the land 7 years. And the woman arose and did after the saying of the man of God. And she went with her household and sojourned in the land of the Philistines 7 years. And it came to pass at the 7 years' end that the woman returned out of the land of the Philistines, and she went forth a crying to the king for her house and for her land. And the king talked with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, saying, Tell me, I pray thee, all the great things that Elisha hath done. And it came to pass, as he was telling the king how he had restored a dead body to life, that behold, the woman whose son he had restored to life cried to the king for her house and for her land. And Gehazi said, My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son, whom Elisha restored to life. And when the king asked the woman, she told him. So the king appointed unto her a certain officer, saying, Restore all that was hers, and all the fruits of the field since the day that she left the land, even until now. And Elisha came to Damascus, and Benhadad the king of Syria was sick, and it was told him, saying, The man of God is come hither. And the king said unto Hazael, Take a present in thine hand, and go and meet the man of God, and inquire of the Lord by him, saying, Shall I recover of this disease? And so Hazael went to meet him, and took a present with him, even of every good thing of Damascus, 40 camels burdened, and came and stood before him, and said, Thy son Benhadad, king of Syria, hath sent me to thee, saying, Shall I recover of this disease? And Elisha said unto him, Go, say unto him, Thou mayest certainly recover, howbeit the Lord hath showed me that he shall surely die. And he settled his countenance steadfastly until he was ashamed, and the man of God wept. And Hazael said, Why weepeth my Lord? And he answered and he said, Because I know the evil that thou wilt do to the children of Israel. Their strongholds wilt thou set on fire, their young men wilt thou slay with the sword, and wilt dash their children and rip up their women with child. And Hazael said, But what is thy servant a dog, that he should do this great thing? And Elisha said, The Lord hath showed me that thou shalt be king over Syria. And so he departed from Elisha, and he came to his master, who said unto him, What said Elisha to thee? And he answered, and he told me that thou shouldest surely recover. And it came to pass on the morrow that he took a thick cloth, and he dipped it in water, and he spread it on his face, so that he died. And Hazael reigned in his stead. And we'll stop right there. So chapter 8, there are several different pieces, I guess you could say, of this chapter. And we'll look at the first two this evening. And so here at the beginning, God has revealed to Elisha that there's another famine coming. Now, the duration of this, he says specifically that this is going to take place for 7 years. And so the fact that this is a very specific set time, 7 years of famine, suggests that this isn't just a famine as a result of, poor harvest or anything like that. That this seems to be a direct result of a judgment of God. Right? For the fact that this is a 7-year judgment, it seems to be that this is God judging Israel for a lack of covenant faithfulness, which was typical. And this happened every so often, I guess you could say. And we'll see this more as we get into the next week. But Jehoram, who was still the king at this particular time, he was better than his parents. He was better than Ahab, which was the instigator and the originator of the fall of Israel due to his bringing in of idols and idolatrous practices. And so the king here is not setting a good spiritual example for the nation to follow. And by this, we can see that God bringing this judgment upon Israel. And again, I think we can safely say this famine was a judgment. That God bringing this judgment was due course for the sins of the people. And so here in verse 1, Elisha warns, now she hasn't been mentioned in a while, but Elisha warns the Shunammite woman. And this goes back several chapters ago, where if you remember, she knew Elisha was a man of God, and she told her husband, I want to do something good for him. And so they end up building him a room so that as he's passing through their town, he could stay there, he could be refreshed, have everything he needs. And so she had been very kind to him, and Elisha seeming now like he wants to kind of repay that favor. You did me a kindness. I want to do you a kindness. God revealed this famine is coming. And so I'm warning you to get out, because this isn't just a short-term thing, right? 7 years. This is a long time for your family to go without, the sustenance that it needs. And so he goes to her. She warns her. He tells her, you need to get out. She leaves. They go to Philistine territory. And then after 7 years, she comes back. And as she comes back, she goes to the king to plead for her land, for her home back. Now, we don't know. We're not told. We don't know what happened with her land while she was gone. It's possible that she sold it and used the funds to survive the 7 years in Philistine territory. It's possible it was just kind of taken over by the king, and it was kind of owned, I guess we would kind of say, by the state. We're not told exactly what it was, but she does go to the king to try and get this back. And now, if they had sold it, this was a right given to her in the law. You can go read this in Leviticus chapter 25, that if you had to sell land for a particular reason, that you had the right to go buy that land back. Now, we don't know, again, I don't know that that's exactly the case here, but one way or another, she's trying to get this land back. Now, this is where, the story gets interesting, is for some reason, the king, and again, we're not told why, the king is speaking to Gehazi. Now, this could possibly suggest that this story takes place before, Gehazi was cursed with leprosy. It seems probably actually likely that is the case. But as we've seen a handful of times now, the author of Kings is not strictly concerned with chronology. He's concerned with the spiritual state of the nation. If he's telling things out of strict chronological order, it doesn't, it doesn't really matter unless the chronology matters, in which case he does give it in the accurate order, but here it doesn't. And so the king is speaking to Gehazi, and he's asking him, tell me all these things that Elisha has done. And to me, this is so fascinating, because he would have known some of them. The exploits, I guess you could say, of Elisha would have probably been well known, as would have, as they would have been with Elijah as well. But they're so fascinating. The king is not a believer. The king is not a follower of God, and yet he wants to know what this man of God has done, because they're so fantastical. And so Gehazi begins, telling him these stories, and he begins, obviously, he works his way to the Shunammite woman, because if you're telling the miraculous deeds of Elisha, the resurrection of this boy would have been the top of that list. Right? This is the greatest thing that has happened as far as the miracles were concerned. And so he's telling him this story, and it's during the telling of that story that the actual woman walks in. And so she comes in, and she's talking to the king. And this is one of those times I would love to have been there. I would imagine that not only Jehoram, but probably Gehazi as well, were astonished. They could not believe that this is the woman who happens to walk in at this particular time. And you actually see in the text there in verse 5, he says, Gehazi said, "My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son." So not only is this the woman of the story, but this is the very one who Elisha resurrected from the dead. And so the king is really overcome with this, and he asks her, right, to confirm this. She obviously confirms everything. And so he not only restores to her land and her home, but in an interesting turn, I guess you could say, he says at the end of verse 6, restore all that was hers, and he says, and all the fruits of the field since the day that she left the land. And so don't only, not just her land, not just her home, give her everything that plot of land would have produced over the previous 7 years. And so she's not just given her home back, she's given her home back plus a bounty of provision. And so again, all of this is so obviously the moving of God. The timing of this is obviously, the providence of God. But also the blessing of this woman who was everything we're told about her in Scripture. She's a faithful woman, right? She loves God. She loves the man of God. She wants to bless the man of God because he's faithful. And so, from all the pictures we're given of her, somebody who's just an incredibly faithful woman, never given her name. We only know her as the Shunammite woman, but I think that's part of what makes the story so wonderful, is because here is God he's sovereignly moving out of his heart of love and care for this particular woman whose name we don't even know. Right? And yet, because of her faithfulness, God provides. God gives her needs in an abundance in such a way. Again, we don't know how much stuff she got, but enough that it took care of the previous 7 years. And so God was able to move events together to perform his will in order to care, again, for this unnamed woman. And then on account of the king, what we see in Jehoram here, and for the last several chapters, the king is not named, but the assumption is that this is still King Jehoram that we're dealing with. But for the king here, the king was clearly interested, I guess we could say, in the movings of God. He's very clearly interested in the miraculous events surrounding God's man, God's prophet. He's interested with this. He's enamored with this. He wants to hear the stories. But again, I mentioned this earlier. Chapter 3 tells us that kind of the definition of his reign is that not only did he do evil things, but he cleaved to the sins of Jeroboam. He didn't cease the practices of idolatry that had been taking place in Israel. In fact, he furthered them. And so we see here that he was still an evil king. He was still a wicked king. But like so many, he could see the truth, right? He could understand that Elisha was doing things that people don't do. People can't do. There was something empowering Elisha to be able to do the things that he was fascinated by. Gehazi, come and just tell me the things that Elisha has done. And so he was enticed by the truth. He was interested in the truth, but he didn't believe it. And that's the dividing line, right? There is a huge, tremendous difference in somebody who has knowledge of the Bible, maybe even is fascinated by the Bible, but they don't believe it. They don't believe the doctrine it teaches. There are a whole lot of people out there that will turn to this book and they say, hey, I think it teaches good morals. I think there are good values to be seen in the scriptures. I've even heard atheists say that they think the Bible should be taught in schools specifically because we see that there is at least some good morals that are taught there. And so they can see that it's even inherently good. They may be even interested by it. They may have even devoted their life to studying it. But the question isn't, how much have you put to memorization? The question is, do you believe it? Do you believe it to be true? And not just some of it, not just the parts that you like. Do you believe the scriptures? Jehoram here, he didn't. He was interested by the things of God, but he didn't believe them. And so this is, Jehoram then stands kind of as a warning. I won't say example. He stands as a warning against those who might be fascinated with God, fascinated with Scripture, fascinated with Christianity, but at the end of the day, they don't believe. And Jesus himself said in the Sermon on the Mount, many will say to me on that day, didn't we do all these wonderful works? We did all these things in your name, and yet Jesus will say, "Depart from me, you workers of iniquity, for I never knew you." Right? And so there's a big difference in knowing and believing. Right? And so Jehoram stood on one side, and we need to stand on the other. And then we get to kind of story number 2. There's a really strict break here at between verses 6 and 7, where these things aren't completely related at all. And so Elisha, and again, we're not given all the details. That's not the concern of the author here. Elisha is in Damascus. I think we can assume that if he was in Damascus, God had moved him there. Like Elijah, Elisha was moving around a lot. This was kind of part of his ministry. And so God had moved him, again assuming, but God had moved him here to Damascus for a strict purpose here. So while he's there in Damascus, we find out Ben-Hadad is sick. We don't know how seriously sick he is, but serious enough that he is concerned he might not recover. And so he gets Hazael, and Hazael, we're not told here, but there's evidence to suggest that he was probably the governor of Damascus at this time. Damascus was the capital of Syria. And so he was a very important man. And so Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, gets Hazael. He says, go down to Elisha, take these presents. Now he sends so many presents, such a bounty, that the text actually tells us it takes 40 camels to bear all this, to carry it to Elisha. And again, we're not told, but I think there's enough evidence here to suggest to us that Ben-Hadad probably thought, if I send enough, I'll get a favorable prophecy, right? And so this wasn't an uncommon practice. And I'll add this, it wasn't uncommon to pay prophets. And not every time it happened was it a bribe per se. It was not uncommon to just simply say, I don't want to go to the man of God. And we see this with Saul. Before Saul is made king, they want to go see Samuel. And Saul makes the comment, says, I don't have anything to bring to him, right? I don't want to go to the man of God with nothing in my hands. And so it wasn't uncommon to pay them, but obviously 40 camels worth is more than ordinary. And so I think it likely, and well within keeping with pagan practices, to say, hey, look at what I've given you. You go make sure your God gives me a good word here. And so Hazael comes, brings them the gift. And Elisha gives them kind of a curious response, and I won't get into it all, but there's a whole lot of debate about this verse. There's a whole lot of technical arguments about the wording of the Hebrew and everything here. But what we see here is Elisha tells him, essentially, he will recover, but he's also going to die. And so that's kind of what we see here in the verse. And so look at verse number verse 10, and Elisha said to him, Go say to him, thou mayest certainly recover. Howbeit the Lord has shown me that he shall surely die. Now, like I said, there's all kinds of debate. There's all kinds of theories and variations of ideas of what Elisha is actually saying here. What I believe Elisha means by this is that he's telling him, under normal circumstances, given the severity of whatever sickness Ben-Hadad happens to have, if there's no outside force keeping it from happening, he would recover. Right? This is a disease, this is a sickness, whatever it is, that Ben-Hadad would, in his physical state, naturally recover from, but something is going to keep that from happening. Something is going to make it so that whereas he would have naturally recovered, he's not. In fact, he's going to die. And then in verse 11, Elisha begins to just weep. And again, there's difficulty in the exact wording here, but what we see is eventually Elisha gives this prophecy, and then just he breaks down and he's weeping. And verse 12, I'd imagine this probably disturbed Hazael a good bit here, but he asks him, why are you weeping? What where did this come from? And Elisha responds this way. He says, because I know the evil that thou wilt do, right? Not Ben-Hadad. The evil that you are going to do unto the children of Israel. Their strongholds wilt thou set on fire, and their young men wilt thou slay with the sword, will dash their children, rip up their women with child. This is a terrible vision given to Elisha here, based upon the actions of, again, not Ben-Hadad, but on the actions of Hazael. And so the Lord had revealed in this moment to Elisha not only the future of Syria's king, Ben-Hadad, but the relationship of Syria's new king, Hazael, and Israel. And that relationship was a bleak one. It is very dark. In fact, previously, before Elisha was kind of the main prophet, when Elijah was on the run from Jezebel and all that, I think is it chapter 19, 1 King? Yeah, 1 Kings chapter 19. God tells Elijah about the coming sword of Hazael. And so we see here that this is kind of the second part of this vision where God, and that's all we kind of get in chapter 19 of 1 Kings, is that the coming sword of Hazael. And here Elisha gets a little bit more detail. Things are going to be bad. Hazael is going to come in and he's going to devastate the people. Now, obviously, we've already established several times in the book that God is sovereign, not only over Israel, but that God is sovereign over the actions of Syrian kings and Syrian armies. Right? We've already seen him make the entire Syrian army flee with noise, right? And they get so confused and scared that they flee. God is sovereign over all of these actions. And so for God to allow and cause this man to take the throne and then allow him to come against Israel and do these terrible things, again, we understand this to be a means of God using the evil actions of another man to bring judgment against Israel. And it's very fascinating that happens, because why did God command Israel to kick the Canaanites out of the land? Why did God command the Israelites to come in and to wipe them out, to not leave anybody alive? Because God was using Israel as a means to judge the Canaanites. And now God is using other wicked nations to be the means of judgment against his people. Right? And so this is one way, it's not the only way, but this is one way in which God can and does bring about judgment, bring about his will to take place. And I will just add, this is something that he warned Israel would happen should they not be faithful to the covenant. And of course, as we already talked about, they have not been. Now Hazael, he pretends to be offended in verse 13. He kind of, he feigns offense. Now, at this particular point, I don't know if Hazael himself knew exactly what he was going to do. I think he probably had the desire already. Perhaps this is something he thought of as some far off possibility. But at this particular point, I can't say with any certainty that he had already decided to murder Ben-Hadad. However, Elisha tells him, he after he tells him that, he's going to be offended, Elisha tells him, the Lord said that you're going to be king. And you see that at the end of verse 14. And then the next thing we read is that Hazael says, on the morrow, he took a thick cloth, he dipped it in water, he spread it on his face so that he died, and Hazael reigned in his stead. Now again, I don't know at what point that murderous intention entered into the heart of Hazael. But now that he knows that, well, hey, Elisha's God already said it's going to happen, I might as well just hasten the events of this all. And probably not even once considering the fact that he's falling right into exactly why Elisha was weeping in the first place. That this is kind of step one of all this. And so Hazael would become king, and God is going to use him, as I said, as a means of judgment against the people of Israel. But, and I want to close with this, verse 11, I think is so important here, because in the tears of the prophet Elisha, we honestly see the heart of God. And this is something that is consistent, Old Testament, New Testament alike. Let me quote Ezekiel 33 here. It says, say unto them, this is God speaking, as I live, saith the Lord God, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. In other words, what brings God pleasure? What brings God pleasure is to see wicked men and women repent of that wickedness and come to know and follow him. That's what brings God pleasure. But we also understand that God is just, and that God is holy, and that God will not allow sin to go unpunished, right? Because even though he has a desire to see people come to know him, at the end of the day, he will not allow that desire to override his holiness. He will not allow that desire to override his perfect justness. And so we understand that God is going to bring judgment against sin, because that's what a holy God must do against sinful people. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that he takes joy in that. And so I'll give Davis's quote here. He says, there is no fiendish delight in Yahweh's judgment. Here is your God, and you should prize him for his nature, the God who mingles his tears with the fire and brimstone. Right? And so we see and some of them might think, well, this seems to contradict, for instance, Isaiah 53, right? Where we understand that it kind of uses the language that it brought joy to the Father to punish the Son. It brought joy in the fact that this was God's means of dealing with the problem of the world's sin. Right? This is what brought God joy. Not to see Jesus suffering in such a manner upon the cross, but that sin was being dealt with. Right? And so it was a means of appeasing his justice. It was a means of giving him a way to provide grace and mercy for people, because Christ was taking that all. And so we understand here that God is just. He will do what is right. The God of all the earth will do what is right, will do what is just. But that doesn't mean that he's up there, gleeful over the fact that all these wicked people are receiving this punishment. And you can see that, again, the reason why Elisha was overcome with emotion in that particular moment is because I believe he was not only the mouthpiece for God, he was showing us the heart of God in that particular moment. And so it's a very important, it's important for us to understand the way in which God operates with regards to not only his love and grace and mercy to those who have received salvation, but also his judgment upon those who haven't. And so God is consistent within his nature. And I think Elisha kind of showcases that here in our text. So next week we'll finish. No, not next week. No, that won't be next week. I don't know. Yeah, maybe January. I don't know. It'll be a while before we see part 2. But I don't know. We'll get there whenever we get